So we have a full house for Lejeune Montgomery Tobran, which is not at all surprising. And I know the room is filled with people who are experts in philanthropy and in active and strengthening civil society. So not surprised that you're all here. Welcome. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
And sharing your time with all of us. Just a couple words. You know her bio and you know about her, but just a couple words about her. She entered the foundation on a very different path, working in the sort of financial business aspect of the foundation. And her agility and diversity resulted in her moving from responsibility to responsibility, moving up over a few years. You'll tell us how long. But she got her, let me just check because you've got great academic credentials, which I will say just a word about it, and that is her bachelor's degree is in business administration from Michigan, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So she's perfectly comfortable with having cold toes. Her master's is in business administration from the Graduate School of Management at Northwestern University. I should say it's the Kellogg Graduate School of Management, but that would not create any biases.
No relation to Mr. Kellogg of the Kellogg Foundation.
Okay.
Actually, it was a relation. It was his son, but not Mr. Kellogg.
So it's literally a relation.
Yes.
And she's had already a very profound impact on the foundation, both its priorities, but the ways in which the actions within the organization and outside the organization are aligned and integrated. And she's met the challenges that all new leaders meet and conquered them in quite a brilliant way. So we're going to want to talk about that a little bit as well. But welcome. Thank you for coming to the Aspen Institute.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and good afternoon, everyone. I think it is afternoon, or yes.
One of the striking things about your work and the work of the Kellogg Foundation is that you kind of take a problem and you unpack that problem and attack it in every dimension. Everything's sort of, there's a multidimensional approach, a systems approach. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that, and maybe from the perspective of your early childhood program.
Wonderful. So what I will tell you is the W.K. Kellogg Foundation will celebrate its 90th anniversary next year. And this systems approach is one that was deeply envisioned from the very beginning of the foundation. Mr. Kellogg actually said, you know, he wanted people to take on problems and to look at them holistically. Yeah. And if anyone knows Mr. Kellogg and the history of the Kellogg brothers and their well-being and all of the work they did at the sanitarium, he was very much in both physical as well as emotional health. And so every problem that he wanted to solve in community, he felt could be solved by this holistic approach of bringing multiple people to the table, having them work together to solve problems together, and then to take action together. So when we think about our early childhood work, again, Mr. Kellogg wanted us to use his money to promote the health, happiness, and well-being of children. So we could have narrowly said we're about children, but what we know is that children live in families, and families live in communities. So for children to thrive, their families have to be places who can support them, they have to be stable, they have to be nurturing, and their communities have to be equitable so that those families can have opportunities in order to create the environments for their children. And so that's how we think about all of our work, everything we do. But in early childhood education, we absolutely know that early childhood education is part of a larger system. And it starts actually pre-birth. It starts before the mother, you know, actually has the child, but from the moment of conception, we should start thinking about how do we create that best environment for that child to thrive. And that's a lot of our maternal child health work. And you can't do any of this work without facing the issue of racism in this country and how the impact of racism has impacted all of us and all of the systems and structures that we are seeking to improve. And so when you think about maternal child health even, and you think about the stresses of mothers the inequitable care that, people, mothers of color receive. You wonder why there's this infant mortality rate that's, double the rate of people with access, white people versus people of color. And so you can't do our work without facing these systems, and we face them almost immediately as we begin this work, which is why over time, we've become to understand that we can't do this work unless we focus on the things that we call part of our DNA. And we really have 3 strands of our DNA. And so when you think about the Kellogg Foundation, what we look at is work through the lenses of racial equity, community engagement, and leadership. And for leadership, we know, and Mr. Kellogg said, people have the inherent capacity to improve their own lives. We have to position people to make the change that we aspire. And they know what that change is. They know how to lead that change. And what we can do is support them in their aspirations and be good partners with leaders. Build leaders, and leaders come in all forms. Leaders are in community. Leaders are those parents. Leaders are the children themselves. But how do we listen to them, support them, and position them to make the change they want? Yeah. Community engagement is simply do nothing without the people that are impacted. How do you make sure that they are at the table, their voice is heard, that we understand those perspectives? We don't do for, we do with. And then finally, the systems of, the racialized systems that we're working in. Our racial equity definition is very specific. We've worked on this for decades, but I think now we've really come down to a definition that is one about making sure that every person, regardless of race, creed, nationality, sexual orientation, et cetera, is very holistic as far as looking at every person in society and valuing that person, valuing their identity, and making sure that they are engaged and feeling like they have opportunities. Yeah. So that's one part of it. But then the other part of our racial equity definition is really thinking about both the transformation of those systems and then also how do you heal from the impact of those systems. So our definition and our approach kind of has 2 strands. One is that systems transformation, and the other part is healing. And a lot of people think our healing part is kind of fluffy, but what I will tell you is anything but fluffy. And we believe that if you don't do the healing work, you're never going to get to the racial equity work, sustained racial equity work. Because the healing work is where people actually come together and actually learn how to be with one another, learn how we all have been segregated in ways that we haven't been able to learn our common humanity. And so our work starts with building relationships, bringing people together, giving people safe space and voice to reflect on the past and all of the impact that past has had on all of us, understanding the conscious and the unconscious of how we show up today, and then thinking about what we can do together to transform the society so that everyone has an opportunity. And that's our truth, racial healing, and transformation work, which is really amazing work because we really truly are building relationships and restoring communities to places where change does happen.
Often you've heard it said that that minds are changed not by facts alone, they're changed by relationships.
Absolutely.
By seeing each other in a different context, identifying where the shared experience is, or the conflicting interpretation is.
Absolutely.
You see the same thing, but somehow it's a very different story for different folks.
Yeah, it's your truth, it's my truth, and it's our truth, right? And you get to our truth by having the conversation and figuring out where the commonality is in those perspectives. So, and that is the work that we support. And it's tremendous, phenomenal work in the sense that people are starting to realize that our systems and structures don't have enough of those connectors, people who know how to bring people together. And instead, I think we've all suffered from living in a world of denial, and that doesn't strengthen a person. It actually creates trauma. But when you can work through that and live in a space where you can be direct, you can be open, you can learn how to bridge differences and strength and gain strength from that, that's where transformation really happens and change for children.
Right.
So,
and we were talking earlier about folks complaining, sort of, why are you stuck in this moment or a moment in the past? And of course, you're stuck as long as you've never resolved it.
exactly.
That's a sure way to be
Right.
getting stuck. So here you are, you're breaking down the larger problem of inequality when it comes to your early childhood work. You're looking at health and nutrition. You're looking at sort of play, that part of one's life, education, early childhood development, the structures for that, and also livelihoods and security. And I want to ask you about the livelihoods because I think this jumps out at you. If you have any question about whether the foundation you lead takes an integrated approach, here you're working to help the parents be ready for jobs and then actually get jobs. That's part of your early childhood advancement or development. Say something about that part of your work.
And again, I think it goes back to that stable condition in which a child thrives. And we know that family and the parents have to create a stable environment for children to thrive. And again, if communities are not equitable, and families are not having access to opportunities for jobs. And it even goes back to whether they have been prepared properly for those opportunities as they are coming forward. It creates a barrier. And our work says that we're trying to remove these barriers. And so when we think about the families, we know that in many of the communities where we work, we haven't had those systems and structures that connect that workforce development pipeline to the job market. And one of the things we had to learn at the Kellogg Foundation is that our partnerships needed to broaden and include many of those corporate partners. And what we learned is when we brought them at the table, after having a healing moment, we learned that they cared about early childhood education as much as we do, maybe for different reasons, but they wanted the exact same result. They care about their workforce of the future. They absolutely care that people have opportunities when they've made a stake in a community. They also really care about supports for their workers. And if mothers and fathers need childcare as a way of being a productive employee, they very much care that there's access there, and they want to be a part of creating those solutions. So I think our work with some of the corporate citizens of our communities, they've stepped up and they're doing some great things to help partner with us, and they look at it holistically.
To say something about the relationship between that early childhood experience or even experience since conception, from conception on, what is the outcome in terms of that young, then now adult person, in terms of his or her agility, confidence, capacity for tolerating and in fact thriving in the face of change? Wow. What has to happen in the first months or from conception on in order to have those attributes?
Well, what comes to mind for me is all the work we're doing more recently around understanding traumatic impacts of children, adverse childhood experiences. And what we know is when children have these traumatic experiences, and even if their parents have these experiences, and they're not treated, they're not dealt with, the course for them is one that could end up being a very troubled course. And I was sharing earlier about some work we're doing in New Orleans with Dr. Shervington, one of the psychiatrists in New Orleans. And one of the things that we have is what we call our place-based bodies of work. And New Orleans is one of our priority places. And when we work in a place, we work very deeply in those places, and we commit to those places for at least a generation. And so we know this is a long-term journey. And in that work, we're looking very holistically. We're saying, what are those conditions, and how do you bring people together to create the conditions? And in the case of New Orleans, we were talking about trauma, and not only the traumatic impact of Katrina itself, but all the trauma that had happened in New Orleans before Katrina, all the structural racist policies and practices that happened in New Orleans, that children were already traumatized. Families were already suffering from lack of opportunities, and then comes Katrina. And so what we're learning coming out of it is it needed a transformational narrative for the work. And Dr. Shervington was one who created that narrative, and she called it sad, not bad. That these young people are sad, not bad. And the treatment for that is not double up on school resource officers and put police in the schools. The treatment for that is really looking at the child and helping them deal with the trauma. Not deny it, not pretend that it doesn't exist, but actually help them work through it, to acknowledge what happened, to build the resilience of getting through that. And then building confidence and hope for creating your own future. And that's not just the work of the person who is traumatized, that's community work. And that's the work that we're doing there, is really working in the school systems, working in the workforce arena, working in community, women's groups, men's groups, young men of color groups, but really getting everyone to understand that there's an environment that has to be set for a child to thrive. It's not individualism and you make your own way. We're all making the way for many people, and we have to work collectively to figure out whether it's working for everyone.
And what's fascinating is the sense of agency you're developing, kind of saying this is a community responsibility. We each have a role, either through our silence or through our action, our activity.
Exactly.
And that's an important culture change, because we do most of the time sort of say, well, that's the mother's responsibility, that's the family's responsibility, as though we don't have interest in, as a society, in thriving kids.
Well, I think what we learn now is the fate for all of us, however we look at the current condition. And so we all want to build a brighter future for ourselves as well as future generations. And once we understand that we're all connected to what's happening.
Right, and the issues are all connected. So what does this mean in terms of internal organization? When you're asking folks who've got domain expertise, in health and education and livelihoods and financial security, surely you've got a team of program officers who have deep domain expertise. How do they bring their work together as an integrated whole?
It's been a journey for us. I think, let me give you a little background on the Kellogg Foundation when I started 32 years ago, and the Kellogg Foundation today. I think 32 years ago, we were very much domain focused, and there were areas that had, bodies of work that they supported, and we had experts hired in those different lines of work. But we've been evolving and shifting and changing over these 32 years, probably remarkably. 32 years ago, we were predominantly a Caucasian organization. When I started, I was one of the first handful of people of color, based on our president's desire or vision to begin to make the foundation reflect its communities. But you all know that's a journey, right? So you come into a space like that, and it doesn't happen overnight. But 32 years later, we are now an organization that's 44% people of color. Our board is 50% people of color, and our leadership is 50% people of color. So what we've learned over these 32 years is the work that you do in community is the exact same work you have to do yourself. And so we've been on this journey. And so when I talk about racial equity, and I use the word, and I know it's used out there a lot, but I also speak about it from a very personal journey that I've had and that everyone in our organization has taken to really get to learn to respect and understand every person, the value they bring, and how we can leverage that toward the change that we want to make. Our board takes every racial equity training opportunity that we offer. We talk about healing. We've been in healing circles. We don't just fund it, we do it. But that concept of practicing what you preach, literally, was really something that our founder instilled in us. He left a lot of writings about how he thought change happened. And he said it happened by people coming together, doing the work together and learning together from research and studies, et cetera, and acting together. So we don't ask our communities to do anything that we aren't working on, struggling with, and doing ourselves within the organization. So with that as kind of the price of entry, so when you talk about interconnections and how you bring people together to work on a problem, that's just how we see work happening. So we've gone from those silos of yesterday. We now have very interdisciplinary, community-focused bodies of work in all of our priority places and nationally. So, the world doesn't live in those silos. Children do not live in silos. Their teeth are connected to their heads. So our health work also has a dentistry piece to it. Even though the systems don't act as if they do, we know that they do. So in our places, we build teams for place that reflect the needs of that place. And it was funny because in New Orleans, we started out going in New Orleans saying, we do education and we do workforce. And they said, if you don't do trauma and work on our kids with trauma, goodbye, because you're just wasting your time. So we do trauma, because we have to do what is needed in communities if we really are committed to that generational change that we've committed ourselves to. And in New Orleans, that is clearly a need and part of the ecosystem and the conditions that children are living in that have to be changed.
It's interesting how the discipline of place allows you to see, the interconnections are immediately apparent when you can see it before your eyes. There's been a lot of talk of, in fact, Bruce Katz at the Brookings Institution coined the phrase new localism. And I hear about that from a lot of foundation leaders, and particularly when you see perhaps dysfunction on a given issue at the national level, a desire to solve problems at the local level. But you were there before that, before that conversation.
I think Mr. Kellogg established the foundation as a community foundation. We've grown to be national and international, but we've never lost that community focus. So I say we're unique in that because we're as national and international as very large foundations, but in many ways we're a community foundation. We have offices in all of our priority places, in Mississippi, in New Mexico, in Michigan, 3 offices in Michigan, in Mexico for our work in Haiti and Chiapas and the Yucatan. So we go very deep locally, and when we commit ourselves there, it is definitely about what those communities decide they want to work on together towards transformation. And a lot of our work in communities starts with visioning with those communities, bringing leaders together, engaging them, and asking for them to begin to define what success and change looks like for them.
And as a result, the foundation is a learning organization, right?
Absolutely.
To view as learning from the community.
It's very iterative. They tell us, and we learn and we adapt, and then things happen, impact happens, and then we talk about how do you build this new narrative? How do you share this information? What do what is a dissemination strategy that not only works for this community, but then we can start to get other communities involved and replicate. And so that's the iterative process. We learn a lot from one community to another. We don't want new silos to replace the old silos, right?
Absolutely.
So while we have different places, there's a lot of connection between those places. And for example, we are doing some great education work in Battle Creek, starting with a visioning session, starting with engaging the community, but then doing a study on the public education system in Battle Creek. And what we learned is because of the suburban surrounding school districts, there had been this drain of resources out of the Battle Creek public school system. And it was devastating for the quality of education in that system. So of course we made an investment in that system, but we knew we couldn't just invest in that system without doing a lot of racial equity work in the community with the leaders so that they understand, not only understand this investment, but champion it. Because you understand that you can't have a community without a school system. If you want vitality in your community, the one place that you're going to have to start is building a quality education system for all, whether your children go in that school district or not. And so there was all this ground building work that needed to happen. No investment can just plop in and be a silver bullet. So our ability to stay there and watch it and see what was happening and build the reinforcements to make it successful, I think is how we address our place-based work.
So I'm struck by the fact that you are kind of pulling all of the levers of change, right? There's the grant making and keeping that sustained, staying with it. There's the communications function, the strategic communications functions of sort of reframing a debate and also sharing knowledge. You know, I sort of look at some of the most effective foundations do that. They are focused on communications. And perhaps those outside of the walls of those foundation might think, well, that's kind of a luxury. All the money should go to grant making. When in fact, it is a central aspect of social change.
Absolutely.
There's a third place, so a third lever you pull, and that's investing.
Yes.
The mission investing that the foundation does. So as the former money person, investment person, help us understand the mission investing and what your goals are there and how big a part is that of the work you do?
I smile when you talk about that work. And yes, I am a money person, but I think I smile for a different reason. When we first started talking about mission investing, I remember a conversation where people naturally attributed mission investing to subordinating returns and automatically saying that meant less than traditional investing. And I remember my hair starting to curl on the back of my neck. The first conversation, I was like, oh no, that is not mission investing. And we've been on a journey. And so the concept was, we're doing all this great work with 5%, what about the other 95%? And if we are we're the aligned organization that we say we are, that we care about our DNA in everything we do, then there's a DNA component to our mission investing work. How are we looking at mission investing from a community engagement, leadership, and racial equity perspective? So we looked at that 95%. We took our foundation portfolio, which is the smaller of two portfolios, and basically over 50% of that we devoted to mission investing. We set up we have about $125 million now that goes to emerging managers. So managers of color who have not been able to grow and prosper in the investment industry, lack of capital, lack of access. We wanted to direct resources directly to them and actually go out and pursue those types of companies. I should start a little bit farther back than that. The first thing we did was we said we needed to have a diverse staff. that our investment team needed to look like the rest of the organization. They didn't get a pass. And so we challenged our CIO. We know there's some great diverse investors out there, hire them. And so our investments team is one of the most diverse investment teams out there. But that investment team did find these emerging managers that we now devoted resources to. And then we devoted another $100 million to any company that was really looking to do both social and financial impact, kind of the double and triple bottom line type investing. And so we've been on a journey learning how to do that well. What does that look like? How do we find investments? How do we nurture these managers? And the goal was then to, let's start out with the smaller portfolio and then let's grow it into the $8 billion portfolio. Because at the end of the day, the entire portfolio should be one that is allowing opportunities for everyone. So that's the journey we're on, what we're learning. And the $8 billion portfolio is, we can have some very productive conversations with investment managers about racial equity. And they are beginning to sit down with us, to be engaging in these conversations, to say, yeah, you know, our industry needs to take this work on. So we have this evolving body of work, we're calling it is expanding equity, where we're actually partnering, again, with some of the big money managers, some of the big private equity managers, and really asking them questions about how they're taking the racial equity journey within their organizations, how they think about access to capital, building capital markets, expanding those markets for everyone. And very productive conversations so far, but more to come on that.
And then, of course, there's the lever of policy. And I bear in mind how much expertise has been built within the foundation and of course, exist amongst your grantees.
Yeah.
How do you think about policy advocacy? Is this the role for your grantees only, or does the W.K. Kellogg Foundation actually play the role of advocate?
It's a both and in that regard. It's definitely the role of our grantees, and we want to support them in their efforts as well, and we continue to support our grantees. But we have learned that as philanthropy, and the voice of philanthropy can also be a tool for change. And so we are building up our policy function to think about how we leverage what we are learning. One of the things I think we're learning that we have an opportunity to produce the knowledge that we have in more productive and useful ways for the field, for ourselves, for policymakers. And so that is an area where we're really building up, thinking about how do you package knowledge? How do you put it in a frame that works for people who need that information? We've been okay with that. The foundation as an entity has always said our grantees have the best knowledge and the best data. And so what we're going to do is lift up our grantees, and we will continue to do that. And that has always been a course of action. But what we're also knowing is the aggregation of our grantees and the knowledge that we're beginning to collect and understand is worth packaging and producing and really using as a change lever that can go right into a policy strategy that we're building.
And I think about your leadership development programs are all about enabling them to have a powerful voice.
Absolutely.
As well. I'm going to just end on one point, probably. I'll try to discipline myself to not make it two. But you referred to your own personal journey, your own personal experience. You were raised in inner city Detroit, one of 10 siblings. So that's hard to get a place at the table right there.
And I'm number 9, so it's even harder.
You're a remarkable individual, a remarkable achiever, but also a remarkable leader. You have this gracious kind of leadership that it really works. We all want to follow. Tell us what made you the resilient person you are, the successful person you are. As you look back, what do you think were the attributes? What were the opportunities? How'd you get here?
Well, I feel like I was very fortunate because I was number 9. So, there were 12 humans in my family, my mother and father and the 10 of us. So I had 11 guide, bosses, so to speak. Even number 10 would tell me what to do. So anyone who lives in a bubble, is not the place to live. I got direct feedback every day, all the time. And that's healthy. That's healthy. And so I feel like that built up the resilience. When we didn't have time, when we were at home and alone and bored, we talked about each other. It was anything you wanted to do to pass time. But what it did was it built a lot of allegiance among us. So we were a very, very close family. But second, I think it taught us how to deal with issues directly. I really empathize with people who live in denial, or when I learn about trauma and I learn about the part of it where people are not able to address those traumatic experiences and what the lack of being able to deal with that and the denial that has to carry through their entire life, how stressful that is. And changing as far as a life course, I never had to deal with that. Everything that happened in our family was addressed in our family, very openly, very lovingly, but it created in me someone who is willing to address issues because I don't carry it. I can't carry that. I've learned that that would be detrimental to my health if I carried it. So, but it also gave me a keen eye. My older sisters and brothers, there were 20 years between the oldest and the youngest. So my older siblings fought in the civil rights movement, experienced that head on. And I had the benefit of learning through them. In some ways, I say I'm their do-over. So I learned the best of them, I learned the worst of them, and I got to reframe our life with them myself. But I think they taught me a lot. So today, I can see, the vestiges of inequality. I can identify microaggressions as they come flying at me every day. But I know I've built that armor. I know how to work through that. I know how to stay focused on what the mission and the purpose is and to get that done in spite of. And that's what we're trying to build in our children, that resilience and that strength. Don't deny that it exists. It exists every day. And how do you move through it? How do you stay focused, and how do you get the work done that we need to get done?
So kind of a big family like that, I guess, gives you both a grounding in who you are, what your values are, what you stand for, but also a real comfort with difference.
Absolutely.
Like with that 20-year-old older person.
Yes.
So let's open it up to questions. We'll start here and then we'll go to you. Do we have mics? We don't seem to. Okay.
First of all, thank you for coming. Go Blue.
All right.
Second of all, I'm from Detroit also. Third of all, my mother was an accountant at Plant Moran. So
I must know her.
She's a lot older than you. But I am Marla Dean, and I am the executive director of Bright Beginnings. And Bright Beginnings is an early childhood and adult learning center for families experiencing homelessness in DC. So would love for you to come and visit. But beyond that, what I really wanted to ask you when you talk about racial equity, there are so few of us who are heads of nonprofits, who are African American women. because that's one of the things that we tend to trend behind with our counterparts.
Okay, that's a good question.
Okay, and I'm not sure that that mic is on, so for the next person.
And I'm done now anyway.
Oh, now it's on.
Very good question, and I'll answer it in a couple different parts. First of all, thank you for the work that you do. And we do have a leadership program, and we call it our Community Leadership Network. And in our leadership program, we actually pick people like yourselves, people from community who are running community organizations or working towards change in a community. And we bring them into a leadership program, a leadership cohort, where they get to work on leadership mastery, they get to work on our DNA, racial equity, community engagement, and leadership. But then it's about how do you network? How do we help you build your capacity to strengthen your leadership ability through others? And we know that that's essential for community leaders to thrive. You know, we talk about children thriving. We want our community leaders to thrive. And what we're learning is, you know, they all fight the fight every day by themselves. And what we're trying to do is strengthen them by bringing the collaboration, encouraging collaboration and bringing people together. So we know that in our leadership programs, and I know that's a national program as well. So anyone can apply across the United States, as well as we take cohorts of people from our places. This year we launched Class 2, which was 80 of those leaders from across the nation to do this work, and we plan to have future classes. So I do agree that part of getting to the space that you want to get to as far as fundraising is really first working to figure out who your champions are and how do you connect yourself with them so that you're not just as this single entity working toward your own goals and having, you know, taking it from a totally competitive space of I need resources and the only way I get these resources is to take it from someone else. But how can we both go in there? How can 5 organizations go together and say, we're the ecosystem for early childhood. We all need to be strengthened so our community can be better off. And building those kind of networks, I think, is how you can strengthen that approach.
So let's take this next question here. If you would bring the microphone.
I don't know if you can keep
Well,
with the principle, but I can try to build it out here too.
No, I want others to be able to hear you.
All right,
though.
okay. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the healing
Yes.
discussion. It doesn't sound like a finance person kind of thing. But I think I get the concept, but I was curious about, well, what does it look like on the ground in reality? And since I'm a Detroiter too, I'd love to hear an example maybe of a real healing thing in Detroit, perhaps, if you could talk about that.
Okay, great question, great question. So first let me tell you conceptually, and then I'll tell you kind of how it's drilling down. So as I was saying, our racial equity work has been on this journey. About a decade or so, we had works that we called America Healing, which was a national movement. And the movement was really about building a community of practice of people who were working to bring people together. And we called them our healing practitioners. And they would come together, strengthen their methodology. And over time, what we've developed, I believe, is a certain methodology around how you create a healing space in community and anywhere, for that matter. And so that work that was more national, we then reframed as a very local movement, and it was called our Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation effort. So when we launched this effort, we launched it in 14 communities across the United States. And in some of the places and some of the communities where you all would recognize, like Dallas and Chicago and Louisiana, Baton Rouge and New Orleans. And so we took all of these communities and we said, you know, there's a methodology now that we've built. We actually have this methodology documented on our website, and we have like an implementation guide for how to have a healing circle, but also the principles by which you want to bring people together and how you do it. So practically speaking, it is about a very facilitated, safe environment that's created for people across various ages, races, and backgrounds coming together, sharing their personal stories, because we believe relationships start when you start with the person. Who am I? And once people share these stories, what you find is there's this sense of common humanity that begins to build. And so you start with storytelling before you ever get to the issue that you want to transform. But you create this really safe space where people are getting to know one another. And then after a process, you say, what do we want to work on together? And all these communities are now saying, after all of this work, we now want to deal with mass incarceration in our community. And we want to think about how we can build better systems in this community that work for everyone. So every community gets to pick their own system that they want to transform after they've been through this healing process. In Detroit, we are trying to build that community. When we have these communities, we say you have to have very key decision makers in that space. So when we launched, we said you have to have the school system, you have to have the mayor or legislators, you have to have faith-based, you have to have companies, you have to have citizens. So people went out and built their coalitions and then came forward and said, we really want to do this work, because that was their commitment. We're trying to build that coalition in Detroit. We want to do that. We have one in Battle Creek. We have one in Lansing. We have one in Kalamazoo. We're working on one in Flint. Detroit we're coming your way.
So we're going to turn to Christine and then Alan, and I'll come back for more.
Hi,
Hello.
my name is Christine, and I too am from Wayne County, but I went green.
Oh, we like green too.
Good, I'm glad. The reason I want to ask you a question is
Hold
that
up the
I'm a
mic,
founding
Christine.
vice president of a group called Seeds of Peace, and we do work originally in the Middle East, but now it's become a bit global, very global, and also deep into the U.S. because of what's been going on in our world. It needs to be addressed here.
Yes.
And it's a matter of trying to build the bigger community, getting other groups involved so that you can have that strength that you're referring to
Yes.
from group efforts.
Yes.
And then if you have any tips on that, we're working in Detroit, LA, New York, but we're also looking around, casting around for what are the right cities, what cities really need this. And then the second little bit, which is very important to me, is when you work with kids who have been through trauma, whether it's death, killing in their streets, in their societies, you have to deal with the trauma, yes, but there's a limit to which you can deal with it. What do you build up as a resource to pass on when you get someone where you can't open up some things and help them indefinitely and in deep? Do you try to build up other resources?
So what we support are those resources. So in New Orleans, for example, what we've done is we've been training all of the different service providers in trauma-informed care, regardless of where that child or family shows up. What we've been supporting is building an infrastructure of well-informed practitioners at every point of entry. So that's, how we, and they really came up with that. We work within the council of the community, and what we were told is you can't just have one door over here. Everyone has to be part of that caregiving structure so that wherever that child is ready to do more work, someone can do it with them.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
I love the commonality of the detox program or
Yeah.
the starting with the truth and then work with them. We started with 1 year, and when it was so successful, they said, what are we doing next year?
Exactly.
And then you work with them forever.
Exactly.
We're going to move on to Alan.
Thanks. Alan Abramson, George Mason University.
Hello.
Hello. Wanted to ask about your thinking about philanthropy or or better yet, even the nonprofit sector as a whole. Seems like there have been some high visibility critiques of
Yep.
philanthropy
Yeah.
in the last year. The sector took a bit of a hit, probably almost unintentional in the Tax Act with
Yeah.
fewer, now everybody itemizes fewer incentives to give. What, how does that look in the foundation world or even for the sector as a whole? What do we do now to sort of stand up for the sector and strengthen it? What are you thinking? What's your
Yeah.
Or
work on
to
that?
tell the story.
So the one thing I would say is the sector is growing and changing very rapidly. And I don't believe anymore that it's a one-size-fits-all philanthropic community. So sometimes when there's judgment, and the judgment, is valid for whatever reason, it's not a spell swoop where you can just put every philanthropic organization in any category one way or the other. But I do think that there is going to be an attack on philanthropy, and in some ways I think the best way that we can prepare for that is to focus on the impact that we're making. And to be focused on that impact and have that narrative ready to go in that regard. At the end of the day, philanthropy was created to relieve the burden of government, right? To begin to produce and provide the fuel for innovation and change and how we can look at systemic structures. For us, some people, our attack is usually you guys are too left focused. You don't get it. You're pie in the sky dreamers over here, coming to the real world. Well, what we're doing at the Kellogg Foundation is we are coming into the real world. We are partnering. What we say with that is let's sit down and let's partner and let's see where there is commonality, because our focus is on children. We're bipartisan. That anyone who cares about children, we're there. So in Mississippi, for example, one of the partners we have is Governor Phil Bryant, who is a very stark conservative, very much someone who is very satisfied with current leadership. But he and I have a wonderful partnership because in his last year of his tenure, he decided that he wanted to make children and early childhood his legacy. We said, absolutely, let's talk. Let's be a part of that. And he's been a great partner with us on that. So I think what we have to do is be very open-minded and to be very focused on what our mission is and not to get caught up in politics at all. And to be open to thinking, because that's what philanthropy was to be about, is to listen to all perspectives and try to find the way through and support that way through.
So what I'm going to do is actually identify 3 questioners so we can get them rapid fire because we're so short on time. Let me just put a finer point on the issue of there's also the funding across difference. And the Kellogg Foundation worked with the Koch Foundation, for example, on criminal justice reform.
Exactly.
You're seeing more and more of that across ideologies. So we're going to Elizabeth. And
we
we're
have
coming
to be consistent in it all.
Yeah. So Elizabeth's right here in the red
Elizabeth
top.
Forrest from the Urban
Hi,
Institute.
Elizabeth. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to see you, and I really enjoyed your remarks.
Thank you.
I'm wondering how you work with other foundations and how you communicate what you're doing and bring in partnerships so that they can learn from what you're doing.
Yeah.
And then right behind Alan, if
Okay,
you would take my, and I'm going to take them 3 in a row.
Okay.
Oh, so you're not, okay, and the gentleman way in the back, on the far right. My far right. And then we'll move forward.
Rob Wilson, Black, CEO of Sojourners. Thanks for Dr. Gail Christophers and your work on truth and racial healing. My question is about working with faith communities. So we work on voter protection and census work, but it's a double-edged sword working with faith communities because they bring resilience and strength, but white Christian American leaders in general have tied theology to a skin color hierarchy. How do you navigate that, or what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah.
Those are such big questions, I'm not going to go to the third yet.
Yeah. Okay, how do we work with foundations and how do we work with churches? Woo, that could take the rest of the day. With foundations, and we'll come back to that, but with foundations, I think we're partnering more and more. There are a lot of forums for foundations to come together and a lot of collaboration and partnerships. We are in so many partnerships with other foundations. We partner with a cohort of foundations around health equity. There's a consortium of foundations. There's another consortium of foundations in the impact investing space. We sit at that table. There's a lot of partnership happening now around Census 2020. And actually now foundations are building joint funding around things like some of the most important things. So we are part of, we built a pool of resources for Census 2020 and actually mapped out, regardless of which foundation and our priority places are theirs, we just mapped out and said, where will be the most need for resources in hard to reach places? And we all pooled resources to fund that. So I think collaboration in foundations is growing and getting stronger. So thank you for the question.
Are you learning from one another in your day-to-day work?
So I think we are, but I think there's an opportunity there to learn more. Some of the work we're doing, so our technology teams work together. And there's some work going on about how we share not only best practices with ourselves, but with the field. So I think more of that is coming in the future, but it's desperately needed. So on the issue of faith-based institutions, so we, in our communities particularly, we always are saying we gotta have the faith-based voice at the table. And we very much know that that's a lever for change in communities, is one of the anchor institutions in a community. And that's how we think about our faith-based partners. So we fund some of the national faith-based organizations, but locally we really try to figure out how to make sure that they're engaged as well. And they go through healing as well. They believe in healing.
I think there were some things in scripture about that, as I recall. The lady in the black top with a raised hand, and then I'm going to just say a word and bring us to a close.
So, hi, Lejeune. Maggie Osborne with United Philanthropy Forum. Nice to see you. Thank you for the support of the census work. It's incredibly important, both at the national level, but also encouraging people at the local level. We've been working on it, a lot of people in this room. My question is, though, when you talk about your work with early childhood, you talk about doing things for a generation. When we talk about things like the census, it's been so episodic, and philanthropy consistently does civil society kinds of engagement in episodic ways, like ACA Navigators that we all funded and then said, thanks very much. And now when it's time to do the census, we're doing it again.
Yeah.
When it's time to get out the vote, we do it again. So can you talk about when you and Ford and the other came together around census this time, are you talking about a longer term strategy about how that investment can support sustainable civil infrastructure?
We could. I think that's a very good suggestion. And what I would say is the table is set for that. And we tend to come together around crises. But I think you make a very valid point. And where I see that happening is, for example, when we do our place-based work, there are other foundations that are in those same places. And we're having some very serious conversations about, if we're all going to be here, how do we continue to think about how we support one another in building that kind of infrastructure. So I do think some of that conversation happens, but your point is well taken, and we could do more of that.
So,
okay.
So let me just say, Andrea, just one word, Lejeune, and that is that it's what's fun about sitting up here is you can see who's out there, right? And sort of a testament to both the coherence of your work, but also the multi-pronged nature is sort of demonstrated in this room. I mean, I see a colleague who's worked on social and emotional development for children and also on education more more broadly. I see a colleague a friend who works with rural communities, one who works on religious pluralism, and others looking at racial pluralism and trying to affect a difference in the process, not just looking at it. I shouldn't have said that. Graduates of our leadership program right in front of me. And just, stunning leader before or stunning leader after, but we kind of claim some. And Stacy Palmer, who covers this all and has the bird's eye view. And so I just want to thank you all for being here. You're a reminder of all the interests that the Kellogg Foundation has touched upon and helped advance. So thanks for, and our colleague from Ascend, looking at the two-generational approach to a thriving family and kids. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you for devoting so much time to us.
Thank you.